1. My boyfriend B and I live in an oldish terraced house in West Midlands, UK. At least I think it's oldish. We still don't know too much about the history. He has lived here for 5 years. I moved in with him 3 years ago. On and off throughout the years, we've had some strange things happen that we've not been able to explain. More minor things, such as seeing shapes and shadows in our peripherals, different noises when nobody else or our cat were around, or our cat seemingly playing with something that wasn't there and going mad around the house. But I wanted to write about the effect that the house seems to have on us in general, and see if anyone else has had similar experiences that they'd like to share. First of all, you can be in the best of moods before entering the house, and then sometimes, as soon as you walk through the door, you feel heavy and down. B and I feel that there is something in our house that feeds on negative energy, and it tries to project that energy onto us so it can feel stronger. Sometimes we feel negative for no good reason at all. One time I felt a sudden wave of awful emotion and I just cried. I told B to bear with me as I had no idea where this had come from, and he was very confused. It was as if the emotions weren't my own. The experience that has been the more significant was an evening a few months ago where I started speaking with B about something that had upset me. We then went on talking about a lot of different things, and it was really a positive, healing conversation together. We hadn't cried or gotten angry or anything. We're generally good at communicating. As we were finishing our conversation, something black came at me very quickly from the right, and I felt it go down my right side too. I instantly felt a flash inside my eyes fill up. I can sometimes compare the flash feeling inside to a menthol sort of sensation. I turned to B, who was sitting on the sofa to my left, to see that his expression reflected how I felt. He said he hadn't seen it, but he heard a sound come from the kitchen to my right, and felt the same flash I did. I had seen but not heard anything. It was a shape, a shadow figure. My thoughts are that I instigated the positive healing that happened throughout the conversation. The negative entity was angry at me. Sometimes when I feel this energy in the house, I feel like I have to sort of say, either out loud or in my head, "This is my house. Who do you think you are? You can't affect me." And just give off confident, powerful vibes to try and sort of counteract the entity. Some other energies and spirits in the past have given me the feeling that I can be softer with them, and not so stern. But it feels as though whatever's in my house needs this sort of approach to know who is in control. And more powerful here in a way. It's like you just need to give off a strong, positive, bright aura about you. There was also actually another day earlier this year when I was out and B had a friend round. In the pantry area in our kitchen we have a high shelf that we put bits and bobs on, and we had 2 glass bottles up there. It's worth noting that the shelf is a very sturdy one and was made out of a spare kitchen countertop from when the kitchen was last redone. B and his friend were in the living room talking about the recent occurrences in the house, and heard a crash and the shatter of glass from the pantry. One of the glass bottles had fallen and smashed one of the floor tiles. We tried to logically explain it first, but the shelf wasn't on a slant. He hadn't disturbed the shelf beforehand. We don't use anything up there often, and the bottles were unwanted gifts. The neighbors weren't doing any work on the wall next door to vibrate through. Our cat doesn't climb up there. It was a heavy champagne bottle too, so it wouldn't have moved unless it was on a slant. We couldn't think of an explanation. What are your thoughts? Can anyone relate in any way? I'd love to chat about experiences. It all fascinates me. 2. So I thought I'd share my family's experiences with the unexplained, and I can assure you, as real as I'm standing here, these accounts and experiences are 1000% real, accurate, and are both experiences I've had while visiting my grandma's trailer after her passing, while my uncle and aunt who were living in the trailer were moving out one night in 2019. First of all, for the sake of this post, I will call myself Jacob. My dad's side of the family all live in trailers and homes built on different ridges up in the mountains, outside my town and the city where I live. The aforementioned mountains area, where my dad's family lived, is West Kentucky. They've lived there for as long as I can remember, and probably even longer. My grandma's trailer sits on the road a few miles from the entrance to the mountains area, so basically think one of those horror movies like Wrong Turn, except there are a lot of abandoned, creepy-looking trailers and houses. and barns around the ridges. My grandma's haunted trailer. So to start off with, I thought I'd share the story of my grandma's trailer. So my grandma's trailer is where my grandfather died back in 2007, after at least 5 or 6 long years of battling cancer. Before my grandfather died, he claimed to see little children running in and out of the door to the trailer, but no one else saw them except for him. He would talk to them and laugh at them. He was a very Christian and religious man who loved God, so I take this as he saw spirit children comforting him, until Jesus came and took him away when he died. My grandfather died in the trailer in 2007. After that, in about 2009, 2010s, that's when things started to get really strange, as my grandmother would claim to see apparitions of my grandfather at night, standing at her bed, as well as also seeing the spirits of friends of hers and my grandfather's who had recently passed on, or were long since dead. My grandmother died 3 years ago in 2018 after suffering a fall at one of my aunt's houses, who also lived in the same group of ridges as the rest of my family. The fall broke several bones and fractured her pelvis and caused her to go septic. After that, she was put into a medically induced coma. My uncle, who is one of 3 uncles still alive after one died from cancer in 2017, a year before my grandma's passing. My uncle, without family consent, made the hospital pull the plug on her, and she died at the hospital, and a legal battle over the land the trailer sits on would ensue as well. Also the family being torn apart by the drama of the legal battle and fight between my father and my uncle. So my uncle and aunt moved into the trailer afterwards and started talking about how their cat would see things that weren't there, and my aunt would see a mist form at the area where my grandfather's hospital bed was at the exact same time of night when my grandfather died back in 2007. As well as a butterfly that would make a bell on top of the back door of the trailer ring, as if it was wanting in. And my aunt would see her son, who hung himself in a barn a few months or years before. And after my grandmother's passing, also seeing the ghosts of my grandfather and grandmother, and my dead aunt, who also died from cancer in 2014. So in 2019, they were moving to Tennessee. So I went with my father to help them pack up, and move along with my uncle's brother, who accompanied him all the way from Tennessee to Kentucky. As we were moving things, all of a sudden, all the car lights that we had on, making it so we could see, go out inexplicably, even though the keys were in the ignition. Even the engine went off, and the lights in the back of the U-Haul went out, as if someone or something didn't want us to take things out. So after we put the lights back on, as well as the engines, we continued to pack things up until once again the lights did the exact same thing. So we put them back on, packed things up, until I started to feel a presence following me through the house, and I would hear footsteps when no one would be in the house, and also a female voice that said hi, or hello, or hey. I didn't think nothing of it until I got home. 3. Well, to start it off, I've been dealing with paranormal activity as far back as I can remember. It ranged from seeing shadows to hearing full-on growls to sleep paralysis, to having nightmares that completely ruined the following day. The 2 experiences I can recall, the earliest is of one when I was 5 and the other when I was 6. The first one was when I was beginning to learn how to read. My grandmother was teaching me via the Bible, and when she had to pay attention to her cooking and not me, sorry, I was a hothead back then, I ripped the Bible in frustration because I couldn't pronounce a word. She scolded me, and while she was doing so, I can remember crying and being very emotional. Well, long story short, while she was yelling me into tears, I saw a woman in all black with hair over her head, kind of like the girl from The Ring, phase from one corridor behind my grandmother to the next, and then she disappeared from view. I began to cry even harder as I felt that the apparition was God's way of punishing me for ripping his Bible. Couldn't have been any more wrong, but I was still a naive toddler. The next one was when I was trying to scare my grandma and cousin, who was living with us at the time. I hid under the kitchen table, waiting for one of them to come, and as I was waiting I heard a raspy voice whisper, "Hey!" from the same place I was hiding. I instantly ran out and started crying. From about then on out, to about age of 12, most of the experiences was seeing shadows from the corner of my vision, or hearing the whisper, "Hey!" or even hearing someone faintly speaking in tongues. This phenomenon only lasted a year. And last but not least, the sound of a woman whimpering, But this was strange, because it sounded like an echo more so than a sound directly near me. Paranormal experiences occurred here and there before the age of 12, but it was never frequent enough to hamper my normal life. It was sort of strange. It didn't feel weird to be a normal kid at school, then come back to a possible episode of Ghost Adventures. When I finally reached the age of 12, the tapping began. This is when the activity became much more frequent than before. Around the age of 12, I started to go through puberty. I was learning how to identify as a teenager and not a kid, and it was somewhat of an emotional roller coaster. For some reason, I was very much into the supernatural at the time, maybe because of my past experiences, but I was always searching up angels or something involving spirits and demons. Anyways, I remember the exact way the tapping started. It was very strange now looking back at it, but I live in an apartment building, so when it's hot, people turn their air conditioners on, and the water droplets from that fall down in my air conditioner, and it would make this distinct sound. So one day I was laying down on my living room couch. I heard this tapping sound from my grandmother's room. I had no clue why, but I took the tapping sound as some form of Morse code that night, as a spirit trying to communicate with me. 2 taps for yes, 1 for no. I asked it a series of questions, all without a single word, as I simply thought the question, and I would get an answer back. For a couple of months, I thought my house was haunted by some ghost lady, but the tapping started happening everywhere with no logical explanation. I would be playing a game, and then the tapping sound would be made on my TV. I could be reading a book, and the tapping sound would happen on my dresser. Would, by the way. This progressed and progressed, and the little nice ghost girl turned into something else. I began to see apparitions, but these would be worse than the ones before. It was of a tall lady, around 6'11", who wore an all-black gown like the previous apparition, but this one felt more sinister. I remember her having very large pale blue feet for some reason. I would see this apparition when I would walk past a room. What was creepy was the fact she always seemed to be doing some normal human activity, like sitting on my bed watching TV, or sitting on a chair always looking straight ahead and not at me. The tapping would occur almost daily, but the highlight of this phase of the haunting was when I heard a growl in my room. I was watching anime on my computer, but I was distracted by the tapping noise being made from my windowsill. I got very angry and started to argue with the spirit in my head. I can't remember what I said, but it was probably something along the lines of "shut up" or telling it to stop. Then suddenly a pause followed. There was no tapping or anything along those lines for about a good 3 minutes, but then I heard what sounded like the growl of a lion. It was very angry and very close to me, almost about 4 feet. This was the only time I have ever experienced this phenomenon. I quickly ran into my grandmother's room and stood there until I gained the courage to sleep in my room that night. I would distinctly see the apparition of the tall woman at my grandmother's door. It was weird because it felt like the woman was laughing, like she was proving a point of me not talking out of hand. The intense activity continued until I was the age of 14. I had a close friend of mine who happened to be from Nigeria. We parted ways when I was 13 as he had to go back to his home country, but when he returned, he was a completely different person. He wasn't the same kid who spoke only about girls and video games all day. He was real big on the idea of God and Christianity. He was able to speak in tongues. He was able to speak different languages, something Pentecostal Christians refer to as the gifts of the Spirit. There was this one time he had a full-blown conversation with an Arabian kid in his native tongue right in front of me. So he told me of his supernatural experiences in Nigeria. And when he shared what happened to him, I shared what happened to me. He brought me to the church that week, and towards the end of the service, the pastor came up to me and placed his hand on my head. All I can remember was feeling like I got knocked out and feeling very light, like I'd lost 30 pounds. He told me that the spirit tormenting me was a demon who wanted to use my anger problems to create tension between me and my parents, and eventually tempting me into killing myself, all before the age of 24. He also said I was going to be a basketball star. I'm 21 and haven't picked up a ball in quite some time, but you never know what life could pull out of its bag. When I came home that night, and since that night the activity has been on a leash, if I would say so myself. No more apparitions, but I do hear hey once in a blue moon. And if I'm very unlucky, the tapping can get really intense. I mean, full-blown hearing some random surface in my room make that noise, very loudly, like 10 times in a row. Now on to the current and hopefully final phase of the haunting. I've been experiencing tactile hallucinations. This started almost 5 years ago. One night I was praying really hard and I asked God to give me the Holy Spirit, the same spirit that allowed my Nigerian friend to speak in tongues and other languages. I felt a very strong wind come into my mouth, and immediately after, I started speaking in tongues, and since then I have been able to do this at will. It was beautiful, but this came at a price. In Pentecostal beliefs, the Holy Spirit can give an array of gifts from healing to telling someone's future, but I got the gift of discernment. When I started experiencing the sensation of tiny bugs crawling on me, I immediately sought counsel from a pastor, who broke down the gift to me. Before I say what he said, at first I thought I was schizophrenic. I researched all the symptoms and whatnot, but most of them didn't fit me. Still, I'm not ruling it out. Though I am Christian, I always keep an open mind. He explained the gift as being able to sense the Spirit's presence, and this may manifest itself in feeling like you're being touched. This, coupled with the tapping, would occur at different frequencies and different levels of intensity throughout the years. The first 6 months of this year, for example, I had little to no paranormal activity until around a week ago. All in all, it feels good finally telling my story as far as the supernatural goes. These were things I probably spoke about only once to my closest friends and family members, and is something to this day I hardly bring up, even though I experience it. Looking back in my life with the whole demonic haunting and nightmares and whatnot, my childhood was very amazing, and even now my life is beautiful. I'm surrounded by amazing friends and family, and I've gained a lot of control over not only my anger, but my odd bouts with self-loathing. My next step is to completely get rid of this haunting. Even though when I hear the tapping or feel the crawling, I can just command it to go away, and it does. Some days it takes a little more prayer and worship, but eventually it does. I still don't want to deal with it at all. On another note, the demonic wasn't the only aspect of the supernatural I have experienced. I have had multiple experiences with the presence of God. I've had premonitions and even had pleasant dreams that seemed like visions of a pleasant world. My only advice to anyone dealing with what I went through is to never give in to despair. The demonic has power via fear, anger, and, most above all, lies. You have a right to be happy, a right to live life without any extra supernatural bullcrap, and a right to exist. Seek help from whatever religion you follow, and try your best to keep fear and rage in control. You're not alone in your pain. A wise man once said, "Anything there is to be experienced has already been experienced by 1,000,000 men before you." So, that's my dealings with the paranormal, guys. Tell me, what are your thoughts? 4. I grew up in an apartment complex for the first 6 or so years of my life. It has been so long that I don't even truly remember, but I used to live in an apartment complex near Meyer. Well, we ended up moving into my grandmother's house with her after my grandfather passed away, and there were some disturbances I remember at my young age. The first time I ever had something paranormal happen was when I was helping my mom and grandma clean out my grandpa's old room, so my mother and I could use it as our room. I was scared to be alone as a kid, so I slept in my mom's room. They had separate rooms. My grandma had converted one of the living rooms into her bedroom. Well, one day we were taking a break from cleaning out the room. We were hanging out in my grandma's room, and I can't remember what it was exactly, but my mom asked me to go to my grandpa's room to grab something she had forgotten. I believe it may have been a drink. Anyways, as I'm walking towards his room, I hear the most ghostly moan I've ever heard in my life. Almost like some shit from Scooby-Doo. I ran back to my mom and grandma, and they said I was just being silly. Typical answer that a child would get from adults after telling a story like that, and my mom was an atheist who tried to explain and debunk everything she could. On occasion I would hear stuff, I would see shadows, I would sense as though someone were watching me. I was never truly bothered by anything. My grandma would have liked to think it was my grandpa messing around, but I was never really sure. I just knew that stuff was happening that I could not explain, and I didn't like it. As a kid, I loved horror games, and I loved watching scary movies and stuff like Ghost Hunters, which did scare me and kept me up some nights. But it was always interesting to me because I truly believed my house was haunted. But I liked to pretend that it was not so I could sleep at night. My mom died November 5th, 2006. And ever since that day, things got weird, and the feelings of being watched, noises, and shadows increased. But nothing super significant. I thought it was due to the fact that my grandma had like 6 cats. One night in particular that I remember was when a friend came over to spend the night. We played video games, and he in particular loved to talk to me about his dreams because they were so creative and vivid they could be comic books. Well, we went to sleep, and before that I closed my bedroom door because one of the cats would come in the room all the time and wake us up by licking plastic for like an hour straight. Almost suddenly, out of a dead sleep, I woke up. No reason behind it, I just did. I'm drawn to look at the bedroom door as it slowly opens, and an almost pitch-black cloud hovers into my room, staying close to the ceiling. As that is happening, my friend is yelling in his sleep, "No, stop!" And at this time, not only am I scared beyond belief, I have the strangest, most eerie feeling that I've ever felt in my life. I was so scared, but also simultaneously so tired, that I covered my face with my blanket, and I eventually passed out again and woke up the next day. Everything is seemingly normal. I asked my friend about that night, and he didn't see, feel, or hear anything. But when I asked him about his dream, he said to me, "I actually can't remember it." That struck me as absolutely fucking wild, because this man would always tell me about how cool his dreams were. There were other things that I can remember. My dad one night said he was intoxicated and opened his door to go upstairs to grab some food out of the fridge, when he says he ran into my mom as he walked out the door. And as he stumbled back and looked, he said nobody was there. But from his face and how sobering of an experience he said it was, I couldn't see how he could make that up. All of us, however, would occasionally hear my mom's voice calling out to us. And myself personally would freeze and look in every direction trying to find where it came from. Fast forward to about 2013, a year or so before I eventually moved out of the house. My grandmother's health and brain was deteriorating rapidly until she finally called 911 and went to the ER, where she was diagnosed with brain and lung cancer, almost identical to what my mom had when she passed. After what seemed to be a month, she ended up passing away, and ever since that day, that house was not the same. It was odd before then, but after that it went from 20 to 100. Stuff being knocked over, voices echoing from the hallways and basement, loud voices talking from other rooms when you were alone in the house, people coughing in your right ear, shadows walking down the hall, doors being slammed in the basement. The list goes on. I had a friend move into my house that always told me that when he went downstairs to take a shower, someone would shake the bathroom door handle while you were in there. He said it opened multiple times to find no one on the other side, but he was still trying to figure out how I was doing it, until he realized one day I wasn't, because I had another friend of mine come over to my house because he wanted help dyeing his hair black, and I was in that phase already, so I helped him. He went downstairs to take a shower, and when he came back upstairs, my buddy and I were playing video games, and he walks in and says, "How the fuck did you guys get up here so fast without making noise?" We were puzzled as hell until he told us that someone kept shaking the door handle. My friend went pale and told him exactly what had been happening to him, and at that point, we were all pale, scared, and we left the house for a bit. He stopped coming over as much, and honestly, I do not blame him. He vowed to never shower at my house again. Between hearing doors in the basement, seeing shadows, my dad kept telling me how, when he was home by himself, he would just hear my mom and grandma screaming his name from other parts of the house, which drove him back to alcoholism. Then one morning I woke up to find my grandma's last cat that we had died. And that was shortly before we moved out. And when I say the intensity of these encounters intensified, I mean it. All my friends that came over just said that the house did not feel right. Did not feel welcoming, and we always would hear voices or cats meowing, even though all of the cats had passed at this point. I would go in my basement before work and open all of the doors, and when I'd get home, I'd go and check and find pretty much all of the doors were closed, when no one could have possibly been in the house at that point. And this is all just my perspective. My friends and my roommate especially had his own crazy stories that still get me to this day, no matter how many times I hear them. Ever since I have moved out and into a new apartment and now a trailer, I have experienced nothing at all. It has been a nice change of pace. I hope to never experience any of that ever again. 5. I grew up in the Philippines, and I'm used to powerful typhoons crossing our country. While my hometown is rarely visited by typhoons due to its geographical location near the equator due to the Coriolis effect, watching the news about the aftermath of the typhoon was just a mundane scene. But on the 8th of November 2013, the entire country was reeling from what could have been the strongest typhoon of the century. Super Typhoon Yolanda, international name Haiyan, wreaked unimaginable havoc in central Philippines, Visayas region. Tacloban City, the regional center of Region 8, was the worst hit. The disaster claimed more than 10,000 lives, destroyed millions of dollars worth of crops and properties, and displaced millions of people. The locals are used to typhoons as the region's located at the eastern seaboard of the country. However, everyone got caught off guard by the storm surge. No one was aware about the imminent danger days before Haiyan struck the region. No one listened nor cared about the impending danger of the storm surge, which was reiterated a number of times by National Weather Bureau. Thousands of rotting corpses lay along the highway towards the airport, which is located at the peninsular part of the city, sandwiched by 2 bodies of water. Search and rescue operations were futile as well. The entire city reeked of death and despair. It felt like it was a scene straight out of a high-budget Hollywood disaster movie, only that this one happened in real life. Horrible was an understatement. On March 2nd, 2014, I moved to Tacloban City. It was my first facility assignment after I finished my training as an air traffic controller. First job, first facility assignment. I was feeling excited at the time, and all of the terrible things I've read and heard about this city were briefly covered by excitement. The city during that time was still an unstable electricity connection, except for the airport. As day turns to night, the city is plunged into darkness, and it becomes eerily quiet. I stayed at the 3rd floor of the control tower since the staff house was totally damaged by the storm surge. On the 3rd night, I woke up at exactly 3 in the morning. As I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was our office assistant. We were 3 in the room that time. The figure wasn't moving, and I felt like it was staring at me. The room was dimly lit, all thanks to the moon's illumination, but it was clear as day that the figure wasn't our office assistant. I just shrugged it off, thinking that my mind was just playing tricks. The next day I told my experience to my other roommate, my colleague, and happens to have a strong 6th sense. She nonchalantly said, "We're 6 inside our room. The other 3 are just lost souls, probably typhoon victims, just pray." The hair on my arms just rose. Weeks later, my colleague and I were the only ones inside the room. We were both on our laptops, doing our own business, when suddenly we smelled something. It was a sharp, distinct smell of an orchid. I got anxious and asked my colleague if she smelled something. From her body language, I can sense she was really scared. She leaned on me and whispered, "She's in front of you. Don't forget to pray for her eternal repose." I thought she was joking, but I was feeling cold that time. I prayed hard that night. The following day, I asked one of the airport employees if he knew someone who loves orchids. "We have a former employee who used to plant orchids and other flowers near the control tower. She died during Yolanda. he said. The hauntings continued, but eventually I got used to it. I occasionally go to the city's cathedral and light a candle for the eternal repose of the lost souls around the airport. Fast forward to 7th of November 2014. On the eve of the Yolanda High-End anniversary, I rode a jeepney from downtown to the airport. It was just one ride away, around 30 minutes with traffic. For those who didn't know, a jeepney is a ubiquitous mode of transportation in the Philippines. Passengers will sit in front of each other, and the jeep usually has a capacity of 20 passengers, 10 on each side. I was at downtown doing some errands. By 6 p.m. it was getting dark, and hailed a jeep that would take me straight to the airport. The airport is the last stop, so basically most passengers would alight before me. As we neared the airport, we were only 4 left inside the jeepney. I was seated near the driver, while the other 3 were seated at the middle part. As we neared the airport, the highway became dark, the streetlights weren't working, and there were only a few people walking along the street. The 3 other passengers, 2 adults and a female, and 1 child, probably 7 to 8 years old, were dressed in an ordinary way, nothing spectacular, to be honest. I assumed they were local fishermen along the area. Suddenly, the adult male shouted, "Look out along!" which means that the driver should stop since the family would alight the jeep in the next few seconds. I thought the driver didn't hear, maybe because of the loud roar of the jeep's engine. So I told him to stop. He did and asked me, "You going down, kid? I thought you were going to alight at the airport." I told him that the 3 passengers will alight here, not me. What he did next was truly terrifying. He started to speed up. The road was still dark, however, apart from the distance. I could already see the runway lights. We were near the airport. I could sense something was wrong. The other passengers were nowhere to be found, and I thought they went down when the jeep stopped momentarily minutes ago. The driver didn't utter a word. I began to break into a cold sweat. My heart began to pound. When we finally arrived at the airport, the facade of the terminal was brightly illuminated by LED lights. Finally, I saw his face. He was terrified. I gave him the fare, and he told me something that made my hair raise. He said, "You were completely alone before the dim part of the road. When you told me someone will alight, I sped up. I've heard stories from other drivers, just like this one. Did you see them?" I nodded nervously. "They might be those of the typhoon victims. Some say they aren't aware they're already dead. Please pray for their eternal repose." As I alight the jeep, I noticed that the seat where the other passenger sat a while ago was wet. It didn't rain at the time. It seemed that someone spilled a bottle of water or something, and that it dawned on me that they were indeed the lost souls of the area. Remember that the entire city was inundated by a storm surge as tall as a 3-story building. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 193. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. And before we go any further, I'd just like to give a couple of shout-outs. The author of story number 1, Rainbow Cookie. Reddit account Rainbow Cookie, thank you very much for allowing me to use your story, Rainbow. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The author of the final story there, they have a YouTube channel, and the name is Zulu Monkey. That's not the name of the YouTube channel. Renzi Benzi, that's the name of the YouTube channel. So if you like, you can click on through and have a look. One of those weeks recording where I get chills doing it, especially the last few stories. Ooh. Anyway, recording's done now, and that means I can put the fan back on to cool down, because I'm quite a warm hell freezer at the moment. More hell than freezer, it would seem. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.